Welcome, students. We will be taking notes on the rise to global power, how America went from a isolationist country to an interventionist country, all within around 100 years. You don't need to write this slide down, but foreign policy agenda of the Department of State is to create a more secure, democratic, and prosperous world for the benefit of the American people and the international community. So you see how with a statement like this, we are the leader of the free world. And that has shaped our foreign policy, but has not been a quick discovery in America for us to do that. So policies that we will use is we will go from isolationism, which is where America is separate from the rest of the world, mainly due to two oceans that really protect America and isolate America and make America focus on America first. Then we'll start moving towards interventionism. Then we will retreat back to isolation, back to intervention, and kind of this back and forth. But then during the Cold War, we will use a policy of containment, where it's to contain certain ideologies, specifically communism, to certain regions and to limit their spread to other regions and also to the world and to the United States of America. But you don't need to write down this slide right here. I would like you to write down this information right here. You do not need to write down the italicized, the second bullet points there, but you do need to write down several information. So isolation encouraged from the start. So America originally was an isolationist country. Why? Write this down. Because of the Revolutionary War. You don't need to write down Articles of Confederation, but that was a document during the American Revolution and before our Constitution that really was an American first, agrarian supporting economy where we had little interaction with the rest of the world. And so during the American Revolution, we thought that we were fighting for America to be isolated from the rest of the world, kind of a safe haven. But then we also have geography and technology. I think that's probably the most important point there. I would definitely note geography. Might be on the test. Isolation is encouraged because of our geography. As I mentioned before, the two oceans really have separated us. But also we'll have from our first president a anti-foreign alliance. In his Washington's farewell address, after 8 years of serving as president, he will warn us of foreign alliances. And I would definitely write that down as well. That from the start, from George Washington, we've had this warning of foreign alliances and foreign entanglements. And so that will really keep us out of World War I from the beginning until we get sucked in. And that will also keep us out of World War II from the beginning until we get drawn in as well. So that anti-foreign alliances is huge. Also, we'll have the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, and that told European nations to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and that we would stay out of Europe. So any European wars we would stay out of if they would stay out of us. So this is a guiding U.S. foreign policy that we definitely had during this time period. But we start to have a rise of industry during this time period, new technologies. By the late 1800s, a light bulb, railroad, telephone. So it'd be good to write down new technologies. You don't need to write down the second or third bullet points where we had this increased efficiency, increased communication, higher standard of living. That would really fuel this rise of industry would fuel a desire to be more connected with the rest of the world and needing supplies and resources from the rest of the world. We no longer would be an agrarian society where we could just survive on our farms, but we would be this society that communicates and gets industry from other nations. Also, the rise of corporations will draw us into an interventionist policy, the influx of immigration, the growth of cities, again, going from farming to industry, that definitely would be that issue. So knowing those four main points there would be good. New technology, rise of corporations, influx of immigrants, growth of cities. That's really starting to make us think more outside of America, therefore more interventionist. Then you also have um, support of new imperialistic ideologies that make us start thinking outside of America. I would write these down. These are going to be pretty important on the test. There's this greater need for outside markets and materials because again, with a agrarian society, you don't need a lot of materials outside of your country because you're satisfied with the status quo, conservative ism, so to speak. But with this globalism, this global market, you're going to need more markets for your goods to sell your goods to other countries, but also their goods as well, materials. Also, this social Darwinist idea that um, the civilized white race is superior to maybe Slavic nations or more backwards nations, as America would see them, less civilized, as they would say. So social Darwinism was really influencing America during this time period, scientifically and also socially. This idea of white man's burden, which was a poem by a British author, but it really would sum up America's foreign policy that we have this burden, so to speak, to civilize other nations, and we will even use Christianity with that white man's burden, which is a travesty because we start to see other cultures as lesser than, which I don't think is supported by the Bible, but they would try to use the Bible to support this idea that other civilizations are lesser than and we need to elevate them, which it seems nice and it seems generous, but at the start, I believe that it has a flawed ideology. Military strategy as well is going to make us develop alliances with other nations. Believe in manifest destiny. That has been a huge influence throughout the 1800s. We're not just wanting the United States to be from East Coast to West Coast, kind of that God-given right to civilize America, as they would say, um, but to also extend that to other lands, especially in the Pacific um, areas. Also, this global competition will start to become um, competitive with other nations, and I think this next um, look kind of shows this pretty well. As you see right here, America was an infant just after the American Revolution. Then we started to grow up a little bit. War of 1812 came along, and we felt like we were very nationalistic, that we could take care of ourselves. During the Civil War, we would prove that we are united after the Civil War, that we could be um, collectively together. And then you have the Spanish American War, makes us a little bit more proud of ourselves. And then after the Spanish American War, we start to have other countries wanting our help and wanting our fleet and the help of our fleet and the help of America. And so we really start to grow and become this nation that other nations want to partner with. So then we get to the age of imperialism here. The age of imperialism. The age of imperialism was this time period where we started to build up our navy. You don't need to know Great White Fleet, that term, but I would write down build navy. Teddy Roosevelt would call this big stick diplomacy. That basically, we're not going to start wars in other nations, but if wars happen, we will be able to finish it. And so the building up of our navy and the building up of our military would be important in that. Commodore Matthew Perry is going to open up trade with Japan. So you don't need to write down Commodore Matthew Perry, but if you write down open up trade with Japan, that would be good. We start acquiring other lands outside of the 48 states with the purchase of Alaska would be very important. We also have the annexation of Hawaii. So make sure that you write down build up navy. We have big stick diplomacy. We have trade with Japan. We have Alaskan Purchase, annexation of Hawaii. But then we have the Spanish-American War, and that's really where we start to prove ourselves and where we gain territories. Hawaii is acquired the same year, but was not a part of the Spanish-American War because Spain never had Hawaii as a territory. But then we have the open door policy with China, and I believe that that open door policy with China was really what made America this interventionist kind of global power because it tied us to markets outside of America. And as you can see here with this map, everything is tied to going to China. Everything's a stepping stone, so to speak, to get to China. Why do we acquire Hawaii? Well, it's to get to China. Why do we acquire Guam? Well, it's to get to China. Why the Philippines? It's to get to China. So as you see here, that all these territories are to kind of open up a path to China with this open door policy. Well, the Spanish-American War itself, the big things that I would write down, you have a couple of minor things there as well, but really the rebellions and the yellow journalism. Spanish possessed the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico. You don't need to necessarily write that down, but I definitely would write down that there were repeated rebellions in Cuba. That really is going to be the spark of the Spanish-American War. What's interesting is that we will never actually annex Cuba. We will annex the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as territories, but we will never annex Cuba because of the policy that we're going to have with Cuba. But that would be the spark. Most Americans favored Cubans. There's a lot of yellow journalism happening. People like Pulitzer and Hearst and other magazine and newspaper writers, journalists were writing these fevered editorials known as yellow journalism. I would definitely know that term. That really stirred up this emotion to free the Cubans from evil Spain. President McKinley initiated peace and small steps were made. When the USS Maine was sent down there, there was a travesty that happened that really literally sparked this entry into war. So the Maine would explode and kill 266. Americans were outraged at that, so Spain agreed to concessions, but it was too little too late. McKinley asked Congress for the authority to use force, and so we declared war on Spain. So poor Spain was apologetic. Spain was not necessarily an aggressor, though the newspapers painted Spain as this terrible, savage aggressor that was hurting poor Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam. And so really there was this misunderstanding of Spain. And so we really had this hatred towards Spain because we blamed them for destroying the USS Maine battleship there, when in reality it was actually a mishap. It was an accident that happened. And so we have this declaration of war that happens, but then we also have the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment stated that we would not annex Cuba as a state. And we would actually hold true to that. Now, would we totally give Cuba their total freedom and absolute autonomy? No. We will change the Teller Amendment, but the Teller Amendment was the statement that said, hey, we're going to free the Cubans from Spanish domination and give them total autonomy. But what's sad is that we don't hold true to that because of a different amendment, the Platt Amendment, that we will instigate. So this is known as a Splendid Little War because we feel like we are fighting to free these nations, to make them free and sovereign from evil Spain. You don't need to write down fighting in the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, but you should write down that the Spanish surrender to the U.S. In the Philippines. And so the victory in Cuba in 1898, that signed the Treaty of Paris. And Spain gave up Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and also sold the Philippines for $20 million. As you can, I would definitely write down and know these territories. I would know that Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, Spain lost as a result of the Spanish-American War. Though Cuba would never be an actual territory, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines we would annex. And actually, the Philippines would not like that. And actually, the Philippines will fight their own 10-year war with America. Very few Americans know that the Philippines fought a war in the early 1900s before World War I with America. But they really wanted their sovereignty. And it's not until World War II or the end of World War II that we give the Philippines their country back and their autonomy back. But the American people start to question imperialism. You'll have people like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and others that will start to say, William Jennings Bryan as well, that will start to say that the imperialism of America taking over these nations goes against the Declaration of Independence. And that the Declaration of Independence is all about freedom and all about taking out tyrants, but we're becoming that tyrant. The Platt Amendment, as I mentioned previously, the U.S. could still intervene in Cuba. So as you see with this political cartoon right here, we're telling the rest of the European nations, hey, Cuba is free from domination. No more of the likes of Spain can dominate them. However, we kind of become that dominating force, and that's why communism will start to become appealing in Cuba, and they will have their own revolution and get angry towards America. Last slide we have here is the annexation of Hawaii. You should definitely know that there's economic links to the sugarcane industry. That's the most important thing on this slide that you know, is that economic link there. All the way back to the 1790s, there's been that economic link to the sugar industry. You don't need to write this down, but Queen Luluakalani, she returned power to the natives instead of to the sugar planters. People like Dole Pineapple were losing power there. And so she was overthrown by the American planters. Sanford B. Dole of Dole Pineapple, they would overthrow the Queen in 1893. And so there was a request for annexation granted in 1898. Now, actually, the Hawaiian people themselves had petitioned this annexation and didn't want this annexation, but there was a few that did want annexation. Those planters did, and so it was annexed as a territory in 1898. But it wasn't until 1959 that Hawaii would become the 50th star on our American flag. So that is our overview, our quick overview of the move from isolationism to intervention. We'll look at some other notes later on about how we are involved in World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and how we struggle with this roots of isolationism and going towards interventionism. So go ahead and upload these notes, and thanks for watching.